My name is Jos Colijn, and I work at this institution as international officer, and I run a master program for international students, and I'm your host for this evening. It is a great honor to welcome you all at the 8th edition of the annual Herman Bavinck lecture. We're very glad to receive you here in this Augustinus room. It is for the first time that people can join us also online. So that's why it took a little bit of time to set that up. But we also greet those who are watching us online. There's, for instance, a group of students from an institution in Brazil that indicated that they would like to participate. So a very warm welcome to all of you. And of course, a special welcome to our honored speaker of this evening, Professor Dr. James Eglinton. Well, we know each other already for a number of years, and there are good academic and personal relationships between you and our researchers and between our institutions. And we are very grateful that you took the effort to travel, and we are honored to have you here tonight in our midst for this Herman Bavinck lecture. Dr. Eglinton worked for a while as a postdoc researcher at our university, and by that time that was still in Compton, of course. And in that period, in the year 2012, Dr. Eglinton invited some of his friends to study for a couple of weeks in Compton. And this worked so well that it became a yearly tradition. The Advanced Theological Studies Fellowship Program was born. And for those who do not know, the ATSF is a program for which research students from around the globe are invited to a university to do part of their research here in our community, to use the library to meet our researchers, our PhD students. And at the end of the month, they do a presentation of their research. This year, the research fellows are Eric Baldonado from the Philippines, David Krishna from Indonesia, Yanto Muriwali from Indonesia, Thiago Novaes from Brazil, and Mariola Trojanowska from Poland. And most of them are with us tonight. Very warm welcome for you as well, and some are online. Well, about this evening, the program is quite straightforward. We'll first have an introduction, first a prayer, then an introduction, and then we have the lecture by Professor Eglinton, and then there is around about half an hour of question and answers, and then we close the discussion here, but of course you can continue the discussion downstairs in the hall. There will be some snacks and drinks available. Well, but before introducing you more to the lecturer and the topic of this evening, I would like to pray with you. We praise you, God of grace and God of glory, that you have created us human beings to glorify you and enjoy you forever. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. We thank you for the gift of your Son, our Savior, the Lord of glory, whom we human beings have crucified, but whom you have raised from the dead. And we praise you, Lord Jesus Christ, as the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. Lord, you created us in your image and likeness, and we desire to know you better, to love you more. Bless us in our reflections this evening. We also pray for the world, created by you in splendor, but now waiting for redemption, groaning and full of suffering because of war, religious violence, persecution. Lord, we pray that also this evening and this lecture might serve the common good and also help us to reflect on ways how to preach and live out your kingdom of peace that we are longing to see in full glory. Our Lord and God, we ask for your help and your grace and the guidance of your Holy Spirit as we now speak and listen. May the words of our mouth and the prayer of our heart be acceptable to you, our Lord, our rock, and our Redeemer. Amen. Dear all, let me now shortly introduce to you the Herman Bavinck lecture and Herman Bavinck, and also Johann Bavinck. First of all, this is the Herman Bavinck lecture. Herman Bavinck was born in 1854, the same year that our Theological University was founded, and that was in the city of Kampen. He studied theology at the Theological School in Kampen and then continued his studies at Leiden University, where he was also awarded his PhD, cum laude. In 1882, he took up his position as professor at the Theologische School, a theological school in Kampen, for the following subjects: dogmatics, polemics, ethics, encyclopedia, antiquities, mythology, philosophy, and Greek. So that was quite a burden, a homo universalis. In 1902, Bavinck left Kampen after 20 years of teaching to become professor of theology at the Free University in Amsterdam, where he stayed until his death in 1921. From 1911 to 1921, he also served as a senator in the upper chamber of the Dutch government. Well, this lecture series is dedicated to him, and in this series we invite scholars who share Bavinck's love for the Reformed tradition, who are aware of the appeal of his vision of grace as a transforming force in both personal life and in society and in culture. And scholars are invited to address key questions regarding the contribution which Christian and Reformed theology can make to church and society in a global world. Till now we had as our lecturers Professor Richard Mouw, Professor Jamie Smith, and Hans Boersma, Professor George Haring, Professor Craig Bartholomew, Professor Christine Schirmacher, and Professor Vince Baycoat. And today we welcome you, Dr. James Eglinton. About our Professor Eglinton, he is the Meldrum Senior Lecturer in Reformed Theology at New College University of Edinburgh. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on Herman Bavinck's theology on the topic of Trinity and organism, towards a new reading of Herman Bavinck's organic motive. He also completed the first English language scholarly biography of Herman Bavinck in 2020, and he has broad interest in Reformed theologians and theologians, and his publications focus particularly on late modern Dutch Reformed theology, Scottish-Dutch Reformed connections, public theology, and last but not least, the relationship of theology to the phenomenon of multilingualism. However, we asked Dr. Eglinton to lecture tonight on the Dutch pastor, missionary, and theologian Johann Herman Bavinck, who lived from 1895 to 1964. Because we noticed that this theologian has Dr. Eglinton's current research interest, and he also translated Johann Bavinck's Persoonlijkheid en Wereldbeschouwing, Personality and Worldview. And we believe that Johann Bavinck is of remaining importance for the Reformed tradition till today, also in our Dutch context. So that is very important. And it's also very nice and good that we have a grandson of Johann Herman Bavinck in our midst. Very welcome. Let me shortly tell you something about Johann H. Bavinck, even though there are people who know much more and better. He studied theology at the Free University in Amsterdam, as well in Germany. He worked in Indonesia, first as a pastor for Dutch believers and later as a missionary pastor and teacher for Javanese ministers in Yogyakarta. From 1939 till 1954, he served as a professor of theology at the Free University, but also as the professor of missions at the Kampen Theological Seminary. Several topics of his theology attract attention till today, also at our university. His concept of elenctics has been worked out by former missiology professor Kees Haak, and our current missiology professor Dr. Stefan Paas has been writing on the topic of religious consciousness in a secular context. So we believe that tonight's topic is very relevant for our institution. Thus, tonight we invite a Scottish Reformed theologian to reintroduce us to our Dutch fellow countryman, Herman Bavinck. Dr. Eggleton, we realize that in your doctoral dissertation, you successfully questioned Vedhoff's idea of two Bavincks. But tonight we are indeed honoring two Bavincks. However, not the Jekyll and Hyde theologians Herman Bavinck, but Herman Bavinck and his nephew, Johann H. Bavinck. Professor Eggleton, we are very honored to have you here tonight, and I would like to invite you to deliver the 8th Herman Bavinck lecture and to guide us through the topic from sensus divinitatis to sensus numinis, reading culture as a product of the soul, with J.H. Bavinck.
Thank you very much for the warm and generous introduction. Too generous. In the UK system, I'm not actually a professor. I'm just a humble senior lecturer. But it's wonderful to be here and to give this Bavinck lecture. It's also wonderful to see this new location for the TU in Utrecht. It's a really strikingly beautiful place to be. And it's wonderful to see the TU going from strength to strength in a new location. As was said, I spent the years 2010 to 2013 at the TU in its old incarnation in Kampen. And when I lived there, local people would often ask me, hoe ben je in Kampen terechtgekomen dan? How did you end up living here? And usually, the question would be followed up with a supposition: you must have a Dutch girlfriend. So no, my wife is Scottish, and we just moved to Kampen. But why? And people were always surprised outside of theological circles that a 19th century Dutch theologian would draw a Scottish family to relocate to the Netherlands. But I think if you've read Herman Bavinck, that should be no surprise at all, because he was a great theologian. And he's widely, increasingly recognized as one of the most important theologians of the late 19th and then into the 20th century. Over the past decade, I've had the privilege of supervising PhD students working on Bavinck, who've come from all over the world to Edinburgh to write about him, from Indonesia, from the United States, 6 of them, from Brazil, from Australia, mainland China, Hong Kong, Chile, Northern Ireland, even a Swede. But despite all of that interest in Herman Bavinck, it's obviously important to say that he did not exist in a vacuum. As we've already heard tonight, there's more than one Bavinck in this show. He was a major figure in a movement, which we now call Neo-Calvinism, and he was a star in a constellation of Christian thinkers. Some of those thinkers are better known than others, so we might think of his colleague Abraham Kuyper. George Haring has written of how the names of Bavinck and Kuyper belong together, like Mercedes and Benz, or Goldman and Sachs. But Kuyper and Herman Bavinck were not the only 2 Neo-Calvinists. And international scholarship on Neo-Calvinism has now begun to grapple with that, with the constellation of figures. Herman Bavinck is not the only Neo-Calvinist who is studied by PhD students in Edinburgh. Others have come to work on Abraham Kuyper, Gerhardus Voss, but more recently, they come to work on Johann Herman Bavinck. Now, as has been said, oh yeah, sure, I'll move this along. Yes, thank you. As has been said already, this is a Bavinck lecture in 2 regards. That is the name of the lecture series, and it is a lecture on a Bavinck, but not Herman. I don't need to give an introduction, really beyond what Jos has already said, to introduce us to his life. He was born, as was said, in 1895. His father, Koenraad, was a pastor in the Christian Reformed Church, a brother of Herman Bavinck. His father was a noted Augustine enthusiast, and J.H. Bavinck was a profoundly Augustinian thinker. So it's also fitting that we're in this particular hall named for Augustine to think about J.H. Bavinck. Outside of the Netherlands, J.H. Bavinck had a steady readership among missiologists and missionaries, and that was the case from the 1960s onwards. And that was due to the influence of his book, Introduction to the Science of Missions. That was published in English in 1961, which was while he was still alive. That book was regularly assigned on seminary reading lists and in the English-speaking world. And actually, in my own story, I read J.H. Bavinck before I read Herman Bavinck when I was a student at seminary, because I found Introduction to the Science of Missions on a bookshelf, and Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics hadn't quite come out yet. So I read him first. But in recent years, the English missiologist Dan Strange has been working to popularize J.H. Bavinck's missiological insights. The late Tim Keller did the same. And that work is all very valuable, but J.H. Bavinck was not only a missiologist, and that is something that international scholarship is now recognizing more and more. He wrote on many different topics. He wrote, for example, a commentary on the entire New Testament, and it's an utterly fascinating work. He wrote other commentaries on specific biblical books. He published extensive work on psychology. He was probably the leading Reformed figure to engage with Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung in the early 20th century. He wrote books on ethics, on the question of race, on work. He was a pastor. One of the things that I find very intriguing about him is the description of him in the 1920s as a pastor philosopher. And that's a very unusual combination to describe someone. I can't think of many other figures who've attracted that as the description that makes sense of what they're doing. Some of his books are quite hard to fit within a single conventional genre of literature, or even a single intellectual discipline. And we see this throughout the development of his work, even from his PhD. So Jos mentioned that his PhD was in Erlangen in Germany, and it was on the religious psychology of the medieval German mystic Henry Suso. What discipline does that fit within? Is it history? Is it psychology? Is it theology? It really doesn't land immediately within a neat disciplinary set of limits. And that's part of what makes him so interesting. Last year, I published the first English translation of his book, Persoonlijkheid en Wereldbeschouwing, Personality and Worldview. And even as the translator, I'm not sure which genre the book belongs within. It's part philosophy, part psychology, part theology, part cultural analysis, part history. And the combination of those things is very good. There was something polymathic about his thoughts and his interests and his writing. I think you called him a homo universalis. The Dutch word that came to my mind was an alleskunner, someone who could do everything, or an universeel geleerde, something like that. There's a short biographical article about him by J. van den Berg, who wrote this, that J.H. Bavinck's writings cover a wide, almost overwhelming and confusing variety of subjects, yet an element of continuity is clearly evident, his fascination with the problem of God and the human soul. And that's the Augustinian core of his thought that holds everything together. He only wanted to know two things, God and the soul, in Augustine. And this holds all of these diverse interests together. If I might suggest three brief reasons for the growing international interest in J.H. Bavinck. First is the complex interdisciplinarity of his work, which is to say, this is somebody who has been read for a number of decades, maybe 6 decades as a missiologist and admired as a missiologist. And people are rediscovering that he wrote about many other things as well. And the complexity of that picture is inherently exciting and attractive. There's a lot to be explored. Secondly, he bridged Neo-Calvinism as a theological tradition from the West with the non-Western world. It's been mentioned that he spent 2 periods living in Java, where he wrote under a Javanese nom de plume, Jai Marta Wahana, and where he described himself as having been born with an Eastern soul, where he gained the nickname the White Javanese. If we compare that to his uncle, Herman traveled outside the Netherlands, but never outside the Western world. And I think if you look at his writings, he found it very hard to imagine the world beyond the West. But that is not true of J.H. Bavinck, not at all. So J.H. Bavinck's writings give neo-Calvinists necessary stimulus to think about their own tradition in 2024, in a world that is a globalized world that is very different to the context known by Herman Bavinck and Abraham Kuyper. And thirdly, in a Western context, he lived until 1964, pushing this theological tradition forward into the 1960s. And the Western world of the 1960s was in many ways unimaginably different to the Western world known by Herman Bavinck and Abraham Kuyper at the beginning of the 1920s. So in that regard, he provides an interdisciplinary, polymathic example of neo-Calvinistic thought in a Western setting that carries on well into the 20th century. So if anything, my plea in this lecture is for Dutch theology to rediscover a great thinker and a wonderful writer produced by your own tradition. My colleague Corey Brock has described J.H. Bavinck as the C.S. Lewis of the neo-Calvinist tradition. His writings have a wonderful literary clarity and creativity. But beyond that, his writings provide pathways between theology and other intellectual disciplines, pathways between Christian traditions in the East and in the West, and pathways between different generations of the same neo-Calvinist tradition across generations. And he does all of that in quite a unique way. One of the ways that I would like to show you some of the brilliance of his thought in building these pathways tonight is by showing you how creatively he thought within his own Reformed theological tradition. I want to give you some examples of his work in supplementing familiar ideas in the Reformed tradition with new ideas, with creativity within a tradition, or creative refinement within a tradition. In this lecture, those examples will be of familiar ideas, the notion of worldview, wereldbeschouwing, and the refinement of an unfamiliar idea that he added to this, which in Dutch is wereldvisie, world vision, a familiar idea supplemented with a creative idea. And then I want to show you the same with another very familiar idea in Reformed theology, the sensus divinitatis, the sense of the divine, from John Calvin's work on Romans 1, which he adds or refines with another idea, an unfamiliar idea, the sensus numinus, the sense of the noumenal. But to get there, we have to begin with another one of his distinctive ideas, which is religious consciousness. So in the 19th and 20th centuries, Western thinkers on religion were fascinated by religion as a phenomenon. It seemed so globally pervasive, and yet its place in the future of Western culture looked very gloomy. It looked vulnerable. It looked imperiled. It looked like it did not have a future in the West, although it seemed present everywhere else. So the big questions of that age were, how should religions be understood in relation to one another? And also, how should religions be understood in relation to the sense that it did not have a future in the West? So there we're thinking of the secularization hypothesis at the beginning of the 20th century in the West. And when J.H. Bavinck looked at that setting, he saw writers who tried to answer those questions by grouping religions together into neat categories. where religions are different from one another, but in identifiable groups, often in binary pairs. Some religions are legalistic and others are soteriological. Some religions have as the highest ideal codes by which to live. Other religions have as the highest ideal salvation from something in this world. Some religions were naturalistic, whereas others were prophetic, which is to say, some religions imagine a human-led search for wisdom and transcendence, if there is such a thing, whereas other religions begin by assuming that there is a transcendent and it comes looking for us. Some religions are primitive, others are rational and sophisticated and civilized. J.H. Bavinck was very critical of all of those binary groupings. He recognized the grain of truth in each of their descriptions, but he thought that the reality of religion was far too complex to be contained in very reductionistic groups like this. And beyond that, he believed that the attempt to group religions together like this as a way of distinguishing them from one another meant a failure to perceive what all of these religions have in common. And beyond that, a failure to ask, why is religiosity so widespread? So rather than ask which generic features make religions different from each other, he tried to explore the religious consciousness that seems to be present across the human population and across human history. So his guiding question in his context was different to the guiding questions of those around him. His guiding question was, why are human beings such irrepressibly religious creatures? And his answer to that was that religion is all-pervasive because all human life is deeply marked by what he called religious consciousness. Now, at this point, I can imagine that Western exceptionalists might protest and deny that religion is ever-present, that it's ubiquitous, because here in the West, most people say that they are not religious. A couple of weeks ago in Scotland, the most recent census showed that for the first time, the majority of Scottish people describe themselves now as non-religious. How can the claim that all lives are shaped by religious consciousness be true if there are people who say that they are not religious, that they do not have a religion? J.H. Bavinck's approach to this was that all people live within the framework of a religious consciousness, whether they realize that or not, whether they know it or not. And here's what that looked like in his thought. By necessity, every human life must interact with 5 questions of existential significance. And he called these the magnetic points. They are things that draw human beings like a magnet draws a piece of metal, wordlessly, but it's a compelling power. Are always invisibly drawn to these 5 questions. It is simply impossible not to relate to these questions as a human being, someone formed in a human culture. And these questions are these. Number 1, what is my relationship to the cosmos? I'm conscious that there is an external world. There's a cosmos around me. What is it? How do things connect within it? And what's my relationship to it? How do I fit in that picture of a world that is somehow connected? This is a question that must be answered. Or at least I must assume an answer to that question if I am going to live for a single minute as a human being. What is my relationship to my own desires within that somehow connected world? I am conscious that I am driven by desires, but I'm also not the only person here, and other people are driven by their desires. And we coexist in the same cosmos. So how do I hold together the individuality of my desires and my place in a community? So this is a question about norms. Which norms exist? Which do I live by? How do I arrive at those norms? That question also must be answered, or at least I must assume an answer to that question, even if I have never pondered the question. Third, how do I understand my sense of free agency as a human? The world around me seems to operate by predictable laws, like a giant machine. And to an extent, that seems true of my body as well. That's why I take particular medicines, why I follow a particular diet, because I believe in predictable outcomes. And yet, I do not seem to be only a machine. I am passive in some sense. I am acted upon, but I also act on things. And I seem to have some kind of freedom as to be not only a machine. So how can I be both passive and active? How can I reconcile my sense of being passively acted upon, but also being someone who acts on other things? That is the riddle of my existence. His way of putting it was, in English translation, that I lead my life and I undergo my life. I make it happen and it happens to me. That question must be answered, or at least I must assume an answer to it and live on the basis of that assumed answer. Fourthly, regardless of my sense of being active, my well-being as a human depends on things that either hinder or help me, and these things are beyond my control. How does my story, which I direct in a sense, relate to a bigger story that I do not direct? There are things that I need to be delivered from, and there are things that can deliver me from them. So this is a question of deliverance. And what are those things? How can I be delivered from them? And 5, the last one, of all of the things beyond my control, all the things that I depend on, how do I relate those things to each other? This is a world of different powers. How do I relate to those powers? Is any one of them more powerful than the rest? Do I choose to make one of them more powerful or regard it as more powerful? Is there a supreme power or a power that I can treat as though it were supreme? The answer to that question will have a profound influence on my life. I mentioned him before, the English missiologist Dan Strange has a book called Making Faith Magnetic, where he tries to popularize these 5 questions, tries to communicate them to Christians. And he describes these as the magnetic points as totality. This is a question of how things connect. All humans have this set of assumptions about how things connect, even if those are only very small webs of connection. If you go to a football match, and I flew here today as I think the only Scottish person not wearing a kilt. As Scotland fans were going to Germany for the Euros. They have a profound sense of connectedness in that moment. If you go to the Concertgebouw, if you go to a climate march, some people find really vast webs of connection. The astrophysicist who perceives the entirety of the cosmos, the monotheist who believes that everything exists before the face of a single God above it all. Some people are astrophysicists and monotheists. That's upscaling the connectedness even more. 2 is norm. How do I live with others? All human life deals with the question of whether we live by a particular norm. Are those norms universal? Or are they set only by small groups? Are they set by individuals? Deliverance. Humans are irrepressibly drawn to questions of salvation by something or things beyond ourselves, from salvation from oppressive forces beyond ourselves, whether that be demonic forces, psychological imbalances, upbringing, family history, unjust social structures, movies about asteroids striking the Earth or alien invasions. Humans are drawn to this kind of question like a piece of metal being drawn to a magnet. Destiny. Does life have a destiny? Is life utterly random, or is it directed towards some point? Can I shape that destiny? and higher power. This question of whether any power is supreme. In J.H. Bavinck's view, in fact, Dan Strange, he describes these questions as what he calls permanent itches that in our work, rest, and play, we have to vigorously scratch. Sorry if that has a psychological effect on you, that people are now feeling itchy somehow, but his idea is that humans all have this itch. They don't necessarily know why they have it, and they don't itch it in the same way, but everyone is itchy all the time. So in J.H. Bavinck's view, these are inherently religious questions rather than merely philosophical questions. And that distinction, of course, is itself a theological distinction. For him, the difference between seeing these as philosophical questions and theological questions is it comes from his reading of Romans 1. He read Romans 1 to teach that God continually makes himself known to all people, and yet human beings continually suppress that knowing. And as such, the character of human life is that humans both know and do not know God at the same time. That is a paradox. That is the shape of human life. Humans look for God and at the same time hide from God. And this happens in our inner lives. We have a suppressed God consciousness that leaves us both drawn to and repelled by God at the same time. Hence the constant itch. Although we are not always sure how we itch, and we often scratch without realizing that we are scratching an itch, and we scratch it in different ways, everyone is itchy. Everybody is drawn, as though by a magnetic force, to questions of ourselves and our world, and whether a higher power transcends it. Those questions haunt us. They exert their force on us like a magnet exerts its force on metal. We are drawn to them. Because, he argued, religion is not primarily explicable as a human invention. Rather, he said, religion primarily is a response to the general revelation of God that happens in our inner lives. Religious consciousness, then, is, he thought, not a set of innate ideas. It's not as formed as a set of ideas. Rather, it's an affective disposition, an orientation, a vague but powerful sense of questions that draw us as humans. Now, of course, various different answers are possible for each of these questions. Perhaps there is no destiny to things, and life has no objective or inherent meaning. Or maybe life is determined and it has a destiny, but that destiny is purely mechanical and naturalistically explained. Maybe that destiny is oblivion when the sun burns out and our solar system will be destroyed. Or maybe that destiny is set by a higher power beyond the universe. Perhaps I am under no duty to moderate my own desires in relation to other people. Or perhaps my desires are subject to the collective will of a group, but only my local group, not all of humanity. Or maybe my desires are subject to a universal moral law. Maybe that universal moral law can be discovered through the right use of reason alone, Immanuel Kant, or maybe it's revealed to humanity by God, and so on and so on. There are many ways to answer the questions and to configure those answers. But J.H. Bavinck's point was that every human life necessarily assumes a particular set of those answers, and a configuration of them. Because nobody is born into a non-culture. Nobody begins life in an unenculturated blank space. Rather, the opposite is true. Every human is born into a particular culture, and that gives quite spectacular opera singing in the background. Wonderful. This is probably an example of one of these points. Nobody begins nowhere. Every human is born into a particular culture, and that culture gives that person a basic orientation in the world, a way to imagine the world. In fact, it's only possible to begin a human life with one such assumed foundation, an a priori foundation that is based on the answers, one set of answers to these questions. So he wrote that they are questions with which the human being is confronted through the mere fact that he exists and that he finds himself in a world full of riddles and mysteries. These 5 questions keep him busy whether he likes it or not. Every human culture, he thought, is a visible expression of a set of answers to those questions. And every human life is a set of implied answers to those questions. He wrote, the answer which a person gives to these questions determines his entire conduct and his attitude to life. Even when he never takes the time and trouble deliberately to ponder on them and to penetrate into them, still his whole way of living implies an answer and is an answer. That is why we find these 5 focus points in every religion and in every human life, even in that of the so-called non-religious person. So let me give you an analogy for this in a moment. In Scotland, very few people are members of organized political parties. Institutional political involvement is actually quite uncommon. And even most people who are members of political parties really participate very little in those parties. A few years ago, there was a national campaign on the radio to get ordinary Scottish people to realize the importance of involvement in politics. And the radio campaign began with a very Scottish voice that said, I don't care about politics. I don't want to talk about it. I'm bored of politics. Politics is not relevant to my life. And then the next voice said, okay, what do you want to talk about? Well, here's what bothers me. The price of petrol and why it's so hard for my children to find houses and why the minimum wage is so low and why the football fans all hate each other. And then the next voice said, oh, so you do want to talk about politics. So the point of the advert was to say that even if most Scottish people don't formally identify with any political party and are not members of it, everybody lives on the basis of implicit, what we could call political consciousness. Everyone has a set of a prioristic intuitions that at heart are answers to major political questions. So the man on the street who says he has no time to wrestle with the questions of politics, who has no interest in organized political parties, still necessarily inherits a set of answers to those questions, and they are the shape of his political consciousness. J.H. Bavinck's his argument about religious consciousness is like that. At one level, the question of religious self-identification or participation in organized religion is more or less irrelevant to his argument for religious consciousness, in the same way that political self-identification and participation in parties is more or less irrelevant to the idea that everyone still has an inherited political consciousness. Now, in that sense, the idea of religious consciousness then becomes a tool in interpreting human culture. Culture, he thought, is religion made visible. Or we could say it more precisely, culture is religious consciousness made visible. The elements of a culture, its music, its dance, its science, its medicine, agriculture, architecture, language, those things, he said, are, quote, nothing but symptoms of the deeper existential attitude of the human being in the amazing complexity of the world in which he finds himself. To westernized people who insist that culture is something other than an expression of religious consciousness, he wrote this: we have forgotten that our culture too is rooted in a specific existential attitude, and that this attitude is, by virtue of its essence, a religious phenomenon. Modern Western culture did not appear out of nothing. It was not created ex nihilo. It has a prior history, even if it has forgotten that history. But as a culture, like every culture, it can be analyzed. And by using the idea of religious consciousness as a tool for analysis, he argued that, quote, modern culture too is a religious phenomenon, either in the positive or in the negative sense. Now, at this point, I want to build the case that he had a certain brilliance in developing and supplementing major ideas in the Reformed tradition. If you know your way around Reformed theology, and you hear me describe his idea of religious consciousness, these questions that yield answers that are configured in a certain way, and we all have to assume them, it maybe strikes you that these ideas assume a backdrop of Reformed thinking. And actually, if you really know your Reformed theology, not just Reformed, but specifically Neo-Calvinist. And in this case, those two big ideas are well-established Reformed and also particularly Neo-Calvinistic ideas in the idea of worldview and the idea of the sensus divinitatis, the sense of the divine. What is the relationship of religious consciousness as an idea to those two other ideas, to worldview and the sense of the divine? If religious consciousness is the thing that teaches us how to view the world, that guides how we act within it, is religious consciousness then the same as worldview? Religious consciousness, at one level, has a kind of specificity that makes it look quite like the idea of worldview. And after all, what is worldview but a set of interconnected answers to the great questions of life? But on the other hand, although religious consciousness has that kind of specificity, it's a set of specific answers to quite complex questions, religious consciousness is also marked by vagueness. It's an affectation, an unspecified but powerful attraction to something that we just can't quite let go of, even though we can't name what it is. Like a piece of metal isn't drawn by words to a magnet, but it's drawn nonetheless. In that sense, it seems less like a specific worldview, and it starts to look more like Calvin's idea of the sensus divinitatis, the general sense that God continually implants within us a knowledge of himself. In Reformed theology, that sense of the divine, we put that under the heading of general revelation, not special revelation. So it's general revelation that happens in our inner lives. It's some kind of precognitive sense that there is an eternal deity, a supreme power, but the sense of the divine does not give us more specific knowledge than that. So religious consciousness looks like these two things at the same time. How does it relate to those ideas? And which of these, if either, is religious consciousness? And if it's not either of those things, how does it relate to them? So first, let's think about worldview. J.H. Bavinck grew up among the early Neo-Calvinists in the early 20th century. And one of the great distinguishing features of Neo-Calvinism was its emphasis on worldview. For epistemological reasons, the Neo-Calvinists insisted that all people have presuppositions. Nobody is neutral. And nobody comes to the answers of life's great questions on a purely a posteriori basis, as though you can ask all of these questions from an utterly unbiased, culturally untouched vantage point that's also infinite somehow and that considers every possible angle, and then you reach your utterly neutral conclusion on these questions. Rather, people are finite. They inhabit distinct and identifiable vantage points, and they're influenced by distinct and identifiable worldviews. Both Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck made major contributions to this in their writing and also in society. And they eventually succeeded in changing Dutch society to be ordered around the notion of worldview. That's why this institution exists as a university run on reform thinking, funded by the state. This would not be possible where I come from because of the different philosophical and theological background. It's why you can buy the Nederlands Dagblad or the Reformatorisch Dagblad. That's why your government funds Christian schools alongside schools taught on the basis of other worldviews. Where I come from, it is not like that, because my 19th century Reformed forebears were very invested in common sense epistemology, not in presuppositional epistemology or worldview epistemology. Now, one feature of early neo-Calvinist contributions on worldview that troubled J.H. Bavinck's generation was Abraham Kuyper's tendency to reduce individuals to the worldviews that they stood underneath. A Reformed worldview, a Roman Catholic worldview, a socialist worldview, and so on. For Kuyper, these could become prepackaged identities that could be imposed on people, as though their individual lives corresponded very tidily to the worldview on a grand scale that they were attached to. For young people who grew up in that culture, those of J.H. Bavinck's generation, worldview began to look unconvincing as a concept in making sense of life. It seemed overly deterministic, reductionistic, a denial of the free agency of the individual. By the 1920s, young people raised in neo-Calvinism started to push back against the idea of worldview and insisted instead that their own personalities were individually formed, highly distinct from one another. The debate that arose was about personality or worldview. J.H. Bavinck's contribution to that debate was a series of lectures at another TU, but not a theological one, the TU in Delft, and under the title Personality and Worldview, Persoonlijkheid en Wereldbeschouwing. That was published as a book in 1928. It's now available in English. And the big argument in that book is that individual personality and worldview do not need to be enemies. And he argues this by setting out a paradox. So the book's paradoxical claim is everyone has a worldview and nobody has a worldview. And these things are true at the same time. Everyone is shaped by worldviews because nobody is born into a non-culture. We are born into cultures, and those cultures give us a certain way of living within the world. And in that sense, he saw it as necessary to be able to paint in broad brushstrokes, for example, when talking about Eastern peoples and Western peoples. And the implicit message for young Dutch people in 1928 in Delft, who insisted that they were freely self-created personalities, not the products of an abstract worldview, the implicit message for them was travel outside the West to realize just how westernized you are. You are local rather than universal. However, alongside that, he also affirmed the individuality of each person shaped by that general culture. Each individual is a product of a distinct genetic combination, family history, individual psychology, individual temperament, individual experiences, subcultures, and so on. The message of personality and worldview is that we must affirm both personality and worldview. Now, maybe this illustration might help. Imagine a group of Americans. They are put together in one room, and they immediately begin to emphasize all of the ways in which they are different from each other. Republican versus Democrat, Northern versus Southern, East Coast versus West Coast, baby boomers versus, I want to say this in the right way, so Gen Z. Okay? Rich versus poor, racial groups, and so on. Okay? And they will emphasize their differences. But now imagine that a second group of people is added to the room, and they are all from mainland China. All of a sudden, it will become very apparent that alongside their very real differences, the Americans also have a lot in common. They have all been formed by the same thing, even if it has not formed them individually in the same way. Personality and worldview was his effort to explain how that works. Worldview, in a pristine, fully formed, rich sense, is real. It is the product of capacious, complex, grand-scale thinking. It's produced by people like, in his list, Confucius, Kant, Lao Tzu, Spinoza, Descartes, John Calvin. Those people did not simply assume a set of answers to life's great questions and live by those answers uncritically. Rather, they asked the questions for themselves, and they developed a sophisticated web of answers. And the worldviews that they produced were then impressive enough to create cultures around them. But, and here I think is the great insight of this book, the culture that grows up around a worldview sustains itself in a very distinct way. And here's how that works. It lives by the worldview's answers whilst forgetting that the worldview had questions. So in that sense, everybody has a worldview and nobody has a worldview. They have different parts of the process of worldview formation. And in that paradox, worldview becomes an important tool in understanding cultures at large. With worldview as a tool, I can make sense of why East Asian cultures are often strongly deferential and hierarchical, whereas Western cultures are often individualistic and egalitarian. But worldview as a concept is much less useful in trying to understand individuals, and in particular, understanding why individuals can be formed in the same culture and yet be so different to each other. To understand people, then, to overcome this shortcoming in the concept of worldview, J.H. Bavinck proposed a new concept, which he called world vision, wereldvisie. A world vision in I should put this forward, if this helps you. A world vision is, in essence, a set of worldview answers that have been separated from the worldview's questions. The questions have long since disappeared. And if you remove the questions, you also do something to the answers. Because the answers become simply the way things are. They are taken for granted, but they also trickle down into the specific shape of your individual life, your own personal history, the wiring of your own personality. And the end result of all of that is your own individual world vision, your own individual, unique way of looking at the world as somebody who comes from a specific place, from a specific culture, which is itself a visible expression of religious consciousness. And the world vision then is inexplicable without a worldview, but it's not the same as it. And I actually need these as two different tools to make sense of cultures and individuals. And if I don't have both of them, worldview will fail me very badly when I start talking to people rather than an abstract version of them writ large. Now, when you read J.H. Bavinck on the difference between worldview and world vision, the world vision idea is very similar to the idea of the social imaginary, developed decades later by the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. But J.H. Bavinck got there first. And I think he deserves more credit for that than he has received. But that's not the point I want to focus on for now. The important thing to focus on now is this, that if you hold together the idea of religious consciousness, where we begin, and world vision, they begin to look like the same thing. A world vision is a set of intuitions about life and the world, and you rely on those intuitions, actually without being aware of it. A world vision is inherently untested. It's like an autopilot setting for life that you receive pre-programmed within a culture. A world vision is a series of answers to worldview questions that has forgotten that there were questions. A world vision treats a set of worldview answers as though they are all true. And J.H. Bavinck described religious consciousness in very similar terms. He wrote, "Even when he never takes the time and the trouble deliberately to ponder on these questions and to penetrate into them, still his whole way of living already implies an answer and is an answer. That is why we find these 5 focus points, the magnetic points, in every religion and in every human life, even in that of the so-called non-religious man." So for now, I simply want you to notice the strange overlap of world vision and religious consciousness. Then on to the sensus divinitatis. Now, to approach this idea in J.H. Bavinck, we have to begin with a debate that was quite prominent among 20th century missiologists. And it's a debate about something called the point of contact between the Christian gospel and what it finds in cultures as it spreads through those cultures. Now, Abraham Kuyper once said that a missionary taking the Christian gospel to a new culture must learn the language of the people. But more than that, he said, the missionary needs what he called, quote, a living rapport with the religious thought world of the people. You must find the point of contact in which you and the people can be one. So Kuyper said there has to be some kind of shared space that is found immediately upon meeting. Kuyper wrote that in 1894, that the missionary and the people reached need this point of contact, this common ground that's there despite their religious differences. Now, the question that develops among missiologists in the 20th century is, what would that be, that point of contact? Is this possible theologically? Is it desirable? What does it mean for the gospel to find points of contact in cultures that are formed by different forms of religious consciousness, by different worldviews? And whether that common ground is possible became a major debate in 20th century missiology. Karl Barth, for example, the great Swiss theologian, said that the preaching of the gospel in all human culture is witness, it is proclamation of the truth, but that preaching never finds any point of contact anywhere in any human culture, because it is antithetically different to them. In human culture, it finds only unbelief and idolatry. Human culture is an enormous no to God, who says yes to humanity. In Barth's way of thinking, then, there is simply no point of contact for the gospel in human culture. One of J.H. Bavinck's contemporaries, the Dutch missiologist Hendrik Kramer, took a slightly different position. Kramer argued that the preacher's own person was the point of contact and was the only point of contact. Wherever the Christian missionary goes, he or she finds unbelief, a rejection of the gospel, but there is a point of contact in the one who has gone to share that gospel, the preacher who comes to confront the culture. So for Kramer, you oppose the culture in order then to affirm the gospel, and there's some kind of common ground there. Now, J.H. Bavinck took a very different position in this debate. He thought about the idea of a point of contact quite differently. He introduced a crucial distinction between what he called formal points of contact and material points of contact. A material point of contact would be something like this. A Christian brings the gospel into a non-Christian culture, and finds points of overlap between the Christian message and that culture's beliefs. And the preacher concludes that materially, in substance, the Christian belief and the non-Christian equivalent are the same. And because of that, the Christian preacher can then build directly on those materials because they are as reliable as his own. It would be like finding someone else has built the foundation of a house and you hadn't built it, but the bricks and the methods are the same as what you would have done, so you just carry on building. In an interreligious exchange, it would be finding that this other person also says she believes in God. So the preacher says, so do I. Wonderful. We mean the same thing. And this is the foundation of what we will build. J.H. Bavinck was very critical of the idea of material points of contact. He thought that it didn't work theologically and also psychologically. So he had a very interesting account of language through word association theory. And the idea there is that humans never use words in an atomistic sense. Rather, words always have their meaning in relation to the other words that human uses. Words are a huge constellation of meaning, a web of meaning. And we always learn new words by their association to the other words that we have learned, and the other words that we use. So with the words you use, every single word is a tiny revelation of a huge word picture, a thought world. So if you find a follower of another religion who brings a word that seems like a word you use, but you don't realize that that person uses that word in a word of worlds that is different to your own, there's something naive in thinking that materially you both mean the same thing. So that means for him that when the Christian gospel is communicated into a non-Christian culture that may use words like forgiveness or justice or afterlife or God, you cannot assume that the material content of that word is the same as a Christian usage of that word. So you can't uncritically build on it in that sense. Now, while he rejected the idea of material points of contact, he supported the idea of formal points of contact. A formal point of contact is when the Christian preacher and the people who are being reached use similar words differently. Here, for example, the preacher might find a culture that talks about forgiveness, justice, afterlife, grace, sin, higher power, God. And the preacher does not assume a reliable degree of material similarity. Instead, there is a similarity in form, but not necessarily in content. So what use then is a formal similarity, a formal point of contact? Well, for J.H. Bavinck, to identify that there are formal points of contact, in the first place, you must be a student of enculturation. You must, and to do that, you have to understand both world view and world vision, because that explains the culture at a grand scale and the individuals differently formed within it. But you also need to be a student of human psychology and human nature. You must know how to ask this question. Why does the gospel find these different formal points of contact in every culture, wherever it goes? Why do human cultures take shape as they do? Why can humans not let go of some of these ideas? In his way of thinking, why do these 5 questions recur, albeit differently, but they're the same 5 questions everywhere, as though magnetically attracted to them? So for this, you must grapple with human religiosity, human imagination, human affections. Now, here's how this works for him in preaching. And this is from his book, Christus Prediking in de Volkeren Wereld. It's from 1939. When you identify points of contact and you recognize that they are formal rather than material, you have already understood something of how culture works and how this culture in question works. That it has impulses towards things that Christianity also articulates. Now there he argued that when you preach to the shape of a specific culture, you do so assuming that all people everywhere, according to Romans 1, respond to and suppress the same knowledge of God in their consciousness. They live as recipients of the sensus divinitatis. Now that's very standard historic Reformed theology. Everyone constantly receives the sensus divinitatis, and humans continually suppress that sensus divinitatis. But even with that suppression, and here comes the creative refinement of the tradition, the sensus divinitatis can only be suppressed so far. And there's still something that is a byproduct of the suppression. It's suppressible, but it cannot be quashed. So there's a byproduct. There's something that is ineradicably left over. And that is what he calls the sensus numinus. The sense of the noumenal is a suppressed form of the sensus divinitatis. And we cannot lose that sense of the noumenal, however we try. It haunts us as human beings. And this is why we are drawn like bits of metal to a magnet to these key questions that relate to being human. The sense of the noumenal is at the same time indelible. We simply cannot lose it as humans. It's vague and it's deeply powerful. And it's expressed in the kind of vague intuitions that we live by, even without critically examining them. And that particular theology then of general revelation in our inner lives, suppressed, creating a byproduct, the sense of the noumenal, is the basis for how he thinks about formal points of contact. So he said that through formal points of contact, I penetrate through to the very vague and general intuitions that lie behind those religions and that find a particular form in those religions. And I then give God's answers to those intuitions. Then he quotes Paul, I proclaim to you the God you serve, but do not know. Now, at this point, if we hold together the sensus numinus and the idea of religious consciousness, and we did this before with worldview and religious consciousness, if we hold together the sensus numinus and religious consciousness, they also begin to look very similar, even though the sensus divinitatis and worldview are very different. The sensus numinus and religious consciousness both deal with powerful, vague impressions that draw us like a magnet. So on the one hand, religious consciousness overlaps with the idea of world vision and also really with worldview. And on the other hand, it overlaps with the sensus numinus and also the sensus divinitatis. Now, I said at the beginning that I wanted to show you something of J.H. Bavinck's brilliance in supplementing ideas within the Reformed tradition. And I've tried to do that by focusing on his idea of religious consciousness, and then by showing you how he relates this to two very major and quite different ideas within Reformed theology, and particularly Neo-Calvinist theology. Worldview as a very specifically detailed organization of ideas, and the sensus divinitatis as a powerful but non-specific sense that there is something, some higher power, highest power. And I've tried to show you that he related religious consciousness to both of those older ideas by pathways, by constructing new ideas, new bridges, conceptually, which then are world vision and the sense of the noumenal. And in that, I think we see J.H. Bavinck as a creative, constructive theologian, a theologian whose creativity led to new conceptual tools to understand culture, to communicate the gospel, to understand the gospel, to drive a tradition forward, to expand its insights, and to do so recognizing the interconnectedness of ideas and life, lives and ideas. And I hope that by showing you this, I've shown you at least a glimpse of why I and others in the English-speaking world are excited about the rediscovery of J.H. Bavinck. But I want to finish by showing you a true story about him. So this is from a conversation with him that was written down by a friend 30 years on from the conversation. Read this in Dutch first if you can't read it, and then I'll translate it into English. Bij het lezen daarvan kwam mij in herinnering een gesprek dat ik met mijn vriend Bavinck 30 jaar geleden had. Op een wandeling liepen wij voorbij een oud kerkhof. Toen zei Bavinck de hem zo tekende woorden: jongen, een jaar of 50 na onze dood weet niemand op aarde meer van ons af. En denkt er nooit meer iemand aan ons. Ik zei toen: nee, aan mij niet, maar aan jou nog wel eens. Daar jij nogal wat hebt geschreven, dat de moeite waard is en blijft. Waarop hij zei: och, misschien vindt iemand die een dissertatie schrijft over 100 jaar een boek van mij in een of andere bibliotheek en vraagt zich af: Bavinck, wie zou dat geweest zijn? Een oude schrijver. So it's exceptionally beautiful. It's a conversation about J.H. Bavinck and a friend walking in an old churchyard. And the friend, and Bavinck said to him, jongen, my lad, one day, 50 years or so after we are dead, no one on earth will remember who we were or think about us at all. And his friend said, no, not me. I'm no one but you. You've written so much that is worth remembering and that will endure. And he said, oh, maybe in 100 years, someone writing a dissertation will be in some library or other and will pull a book off a shelf and say, Bavinck, who was that? And his own answer was a writer from long ago. I end with this because I love the humility within it. But I also end the lecture with this, and that I hope that it might prompt us to remember him more than simply as an oude schrijver, but someone whose writings continue to prompt us to think today, and maybe even to expand our Reformed traditions faithfully and creatively. Thank you for bedankt voor jullie aandacht. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. James Acton, for this panoramic vision of Johann Bavinck's theology, his thinking. I think it was fascinating image that you were giving us, and you were not just digging in our backyard, but you found treasure, I think, which can be put in the front window. Yeah, and so we thank you very much for that. And you came specifically for this lecture to the Netherlands, and you gave us a good piece of meat to chew on. So thank you very much for coming. I think we have some time left for questions and answers.
Sure.
So if you have any reaction, or if you have a question, if you are triggered by what James was telling us, then please go ahead. Yes.
First time I read J.H. Bavinck was in my student time, and I read it as a philosopher. Thought he was a philosopher.
Okay.
And that is also triggering me when I was listening to you. That he's really read as a philosopher, not a theologian. About himself that he was a theologian. Is there a difference for him between theology and philosophy? Because what he's doing is that he's connecting religion very closely to culture. Like all life is religion, I mean. Is there also something specific that you're doing? That you also say religion and faith, part of life next to law or other systems. So can you reflect a bit on that?
I can try. So it's fascinating to hear that you first read him as a philosopher. If I can share an embarrassing story. So I first read J.H. Bavinck and Herman Bavinck as the same person. So then I'd read Introduction to the Science of Missions, and then a year later, the next book on the shelf that appeared was Reformed Dogmatics Volume 1. And I picked it open and thought, wow, it's quite incredible that one person could write both of these. And then someone had to point out to me, no, they're not the same figure, uncle and nephew. So I think that something that I mentioned really briefly early on in the lecture was the influence of Augustine on his thinking. And I think that rather than J.H. Bavinck's intellectual development happening within very neat disciplinary boundaries, he's not so much a figure who's working within one discipline. He's really a figure working on one driving idea. And I think von den Berg was correct in saying that the driving idea is to know God and to know the soul. And that's obviously a driving motif in Augustine himself. But to know God and to know the soul, and if you are J.H. Bavinck, that will really mean that you don't sit easily in any one particular intellectual discipline. So your work will have to be profoundly psychological, but it will also have to be profoundly biblical. And it will produce somebody who will write, Inleiding in de Zielkunde, which is very, it's work in Reformed psychology, engaging with the leading psychologists of his day in psychoanalysis. But you'll also write Geschiedenis der Openbaring, which is the title of his New Testament commentary, where you're just sitting and thinking about books of the Bible. And I think, so what you see in his corpus is there are some works that do conventionally fit within different disciplines. Like his biblical commentaries do more or less, if I had to put them in, where I put them in my office, in my library there, they fit within the biblical commentary shelf. But there are lots of works that just don't. They defy genre. And that's because in his own thinking, he's trying to know God and the soul. And that just blows up a lot of those. It destroys the fences that divide all of these disciplines. And I think, where I began, again, for me, that's why he's such an exciting thinker to read. Because when I read him, he forces me to think in a lot of different areas that are very siloed and separated in university life, where all of these different disciplines don't really talk to each other much, or not enough. And in him, you find one person who has an existential Augustinian drive that makes him go into all of those things, sometimes writing about them discreetly, but sometimes doing it all in one book. He has a wonderful book. So the English title is quite different to the Dutch title. I think the Dutch title is more workmanlike. It's something like De Mens in zijn Wereld, or something like that. But the English title is Between the Beginning and the End. And that's another book that is a genre-defying book. At one level, it's like an explanation of redemptive historical hermeneutics. It's how to go from the beginning to the end. It's like Augustine's City of God, how to locate your own location in history, that you also exist between the beginning and the end. And it's a hermeneutic for how to make sense of the Bible as you read it. But it's also a resistance piece of theology against Hitler, explicitly. And it's written in Amsterdam under occupation in World War II. And it's political theology, and it's deeply psychological. And it's another book that I don't know where to put it on my shelf. They just go in the J.H. Bavinck section. Like it's a genre unto itself. And that's really exciting. I think theology needs more thinkers like that.
Thank you. Anyone who would like to ask another question or to follow up? Yeah, cool, please.
Thank you so much for your lecture. Enjoyed it. So one thing, you were on the half explaining the worldview and the world vision. Then you said, well, now he's ahead of Australia. So in the second age about social connection. But okay, but it's a world vision. Is it an individual world vision or is it a collective? Because in Church it's a collective thing.
Yeah.
It's something that we share about, let's say, how we experience the world and norms and values in it.
Yeah.
Okay, but then my true question is, James Smith, in one of his books says, okay, we as Reformed Christians, we know, or we work a lot with world views, but we should work more with social imaginaries. Because worldviews are rational, that's something cognitive, whereas the social imaginaries fit more to our desires. That's his point. So we follow our desires, and we come then. So and by that affection, we come earlier into our social imaginations and worldviews. What would be your comment, or what would be the comment of J.H. Bavinck on this thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I think so. With the idea of world vision, so a mental illustration that I've used to describe this with before for some of my students is this. So I once saw a video of somebody pouring liquid metal into an ant colony underground. I assume it was empty, it wasn't inhabited. But the point of it was to show the very unusual shape once you take away all the dirt and you just have this metal structure that has filled all of these tunnels. So one common material is poured into this hole, but there's a unique shape underneath it. And what emerges, both common, it's the same metal, but the form that it has taken, the metal is had to fit within what is there and follow the pathways that are there. And the relationship of worldview to world vision is kind of like that. So the world's view is very generic, and it filters down into your life. But your own inner life, every person's inner life, for J.H. Bavinck, has very distinctive tunnels with where they go. And they're shaped by many things that are necessarily unique to you as an individual. And in that sense, your experiences are not anyone else's. And the shape, the receptivity that you have to the common material of the culture being poured into you, even in a home environment, the common materials of family life poured into you aren't poured into the same shape as your siblings even. I have identical twins, and they share almost all of the same DNA, and yet they are distinct individuals growing up at the same time in the same settings. So world vision is it has scope to be something like it has scope to be shared. People who live unconsciously on the basis of the same untested assumptions that they've received, maybe across a culture if it's very homogenous, but maybe in closer subcultures or environments like family units. So I think where this idea has a lot of potential is that in his way of thinking, different worldviews even shape whether world visions are more generic or more individuated. So if you think of the example that I used of a group of Americans and a group of mainland Chinese people, if you take people from a collectivist, let's say more Confucian influenced culture or more authoritarian culture or something like that, and take people from a very egalitarian individualistic culture, they will often have, I think what he would expect is that world visions will be more individuated, more radically so in individualistic cultures. Whereas in cultures where the default is something like a shared world vision, then there's a flexibility with the concept that I think I find that tremendously insightful, simply because of the capacity that it has to be true to life. It's responsive in that sense to what it finds, recognizing that people will necessarily understand or imagine their lives differently, depending on whether they're from primarily individualistic or primarily collectivist cultures. I don't mean to say that J.H. Bavinck arrived at exactly the same idea as Charles Taylor, but I think that there's a common problem in in worldview-based thinking that they are both responding to, which is that humans aren't simply brains on sticks, and that we don't live by completely abstract reasoning, and also that we don't correspond in our individual finite lives entirely to huge, capacious worldviews. So a Confucian person is not the same as Confucianism. But I think where I like the idea, or what I like about the holism of J.H. Bavinck's approach, is that he doesn't ask me to decide. Worldview, I think worldview is such an important idea, so much to offer, or social imaginary. He says I can have, because it's also true to life to say that there are some people who develop through sheer force of will and intellectual capacity and existential capacity, who pursue truth with almost unimaginable rigor. And that one life can yield such an expansive, capacious account of life that is very theoretical, but maybe in that person's life it's also existential. That is something that shapes cultures around it. And it wouldn't be true to life to deny that worldview is real in that sense. But also the way that it trickles down into people's lives, you have to be true to life there as well. So, and that's part of why I think his attempt to hold this together was really commendable, and why I want to defend having worldview and world vision together.
Okay, thank you so much. Also, thank you for really going in depth. I have another question, George.
Thank you, James, for your very interesting lecture. Well presented. I've two questions and a remark. The first question is, who wrote this?
Oh, what was the name? I thought someone will probably ask this, and it will probably be George. And I should write this down, and I forgot to. I can email it to you. Yeah, I can email it to you.
No problem. So, and then about worldview. My sense is that when Americans talk about worldview and are criticizing it in this way, its ideas on sticks, that happened in the Netherlands, by the way, but it is a distortion, I think, of what worldview is. And related to this, and as a follow-up with what Roel said next to me, so the worldview idea may be in the head, and the world vision may be in our heart or our soul. But when Bavinck was appointed in 1939 in Kampen and in the Vrije Universiteit, there was one opponent, and that was Klaas Schilder. He was very much against appointing J.H. Bavinck because of his psychological turn. He was afraid that psychology would, well, let's say, eat the systematic theology, the systematic theological approach. So he was afraid that that would happen. Your approach is, no, this is a refinement, what Bavinck does. It's an addition, it's a step forward. So, well, I'd like you to reflect on this dichotomy in appreciation of Bavinck.
Sure. I agree fully on the first point, that the American conversation about worldview is, it's much more simplistic than a continental Reformed approach. And in that regard, I think the Dutch neo-Calvinist approach doesn't need worldview to be, it can be capacious without being an abstraction, because it's a huge set of ideas, but that are real rather than abstract, because they explain why you could have a reformed newspaper, a reformed university, reformed workers' union, reformed approach to the natural sciences, and it's holistic rather than abstract, and it's bigger than any one individual life. So that I agree fully with that. I probably need to go away and reflect on Klaas Schilder and that kind of criticism. What comes before J.H. Bavinck on this, of course, is Herman Bavinck, and he is the great dogmatician. But when he was writing Reformed Dogmatics, he also wrote Beginselen der Psychologie, Principles of Psychology, at the same time. because he was concerned not only with dogmatic theology, but with the psychology of the human who's doing the theology. But then he called at various points in his life for dogmatics to become more psychological. And my reading of J.H. Bavinck is that he responds to his uncle's call, but he wasn't a dogmatician, and he's not trying to do that. He's responding to the call for more psychology, maybe. But I need to think more about. I should go away and read more Classschilder on that particular objection. I'll talk about it with Marinus as well.
I can tell you
Yeah.
where it's from.
Okay, thank you so much. I think you have time for a last question, and David, you raised your hand, yes?
Yes, thank you. Very interesting. I came to mind the John frame and something that is more related to pastoral theology and ethics. So, in a way, I see that worldview is more the norm. So, in a way, what a certain person thinks about everything that is around him, and personality is the individual being. Would you add also, like Frame does, also the environment and the situation that the person is living in a certain period of time? So it's not just a dualism, but it's a triad, it's a trinitarian way of seeing it. So it's not just the norms, it's not just existential, but it's also situational. Does J.H. Bavinck talk about this, or does he consider just personality and worldview? Because I also see that the risk of just our worldview becomes in a way dogmatism, and personality becomes just personalism and experientialism. And a third category might be helpful to understand that there is something implied in the person, in the way the person thinks about things around her or him, but also the situation that the person herself or himself is living in that moment. Yeah.
Thanks. That's a great question. In the context of writing Personality and Worldview, he was responding to people who argued that worldview is purely an abstraction, but personality is authentic. And he actually inverted that argument to say, no, in your case, you might not realize it, but you treat personality as an abstraction because you somehow created yourself and who you are, regardless of the prior influence of culture and all these things that act upon you. And his problem with treating personality in that way, as though I am just me because I want to be me, and no one decided this for me, is, well, that makes you the ultimate abstraction. And the point of, I suppose, of how he thought about the way that worldview filters down into the shape that's available to it in your distinct life is that even our inner lives are actually ordered by the norms of the cultures around us. And I think he learned this point from Sigmund Freud, actually. Freud is an important contemporary source for him with this, in that part of the neurosis of the inner life for Freud is that I am aware that I am an ego. I have particular desires that conflict within me, but the desires that I want to gratify always have to take into account that I'm not the only person on earth. And if I were to gratify every desire, I couldn't live in community with other people. But so therefore, there is some kind of restraint that's imposed on the war that's waged within you, within yourself, with your desires. There's something that's imposed by other people. And nobody is free from that, and that we're all raised in some kind of community or another that imposes some kind of external norm on things that tensions that exist within ourselves. But those external circumstances are not universal. Culture to culture varies and tells you to moderate your inner desires differently. Some cultures celebrate some desires being expressed, other cultures reject those expressions. So wherever you're from, your inner self is never culturally untouched. Your psychology is actually mediated, is a product of culture. So who you are, if you'd been born and raised in an entirely different culture, even your inner life would be differently configured. And for him to deny that reduces the human being to a cultureless abstraction, and personality then becomes impossible. It doesn't mean anything because it's not something that can be considered in relation to any actually imaginable setting, which is human culture, human community. So not sure about a Framian, three-point way to divide this. I don't think he's quite doing that, but he does have quite a firm rejection of the idea that I am who I am just because I willed myself to be this way. And I find that really fascinating in his argument that the inner life, which I think even 100 years on, in Western culture at least, a lot of us do talk about the inner life as this pristinely authentic thing to turn into, and then you find who you really are, not who other people say you should be, but who you say you are. For J.H. Bavinck, that's impossible. Like, that's a meaningless abstraction.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we are close back to the beginning, Augustine.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's a nice circle. Thank you so much. And well, you triggered many questions. I think this is just the beginning of a new conversation. So thank you so much for that. For instance, myself, I was triggered by the appropriation of dense range of the 5 magnetic points. But well, this is something to be discussed later. Thank you very much for now, and let's give him a hand again.